finite to cover all possible venues in terms of financing for Europe that could be chosen. Just to limit the scope of my speech, because otherwise you might think, but we will have time in questions and answers to address that, are there other aspects of financial European initiatives that should be considered? That being said, nothing is more structuring than money. Yes, that's what my father always told me. He was a banker, a local banker in a retail bank here in Luxembourg, and he always thought that I was too much of a poet, and that one day I should get serious in life. One topic where we always diverge, sorry for this personal note, but you'll see it is connected with what we discuss here today. He never believed that Europe would have a common currency. And at my very young age, at 15, 16, so it's probably because I had heard about the Werner report, I was always talking about that. The ECU and all, the euro name was not yet around. And my father would use that point to say, you're still a dreamer. The only thing that counts is the dollar. And so that I've been appointed finance minister was already, my father passed away a long time ago. From up there, he was probably very doubtful that Luxembourg would have done a decent choice, because he thought that I was not mathematical enough. But then even more so, to become then the managing director of the ESM is quite a paradox for him. So I hope that when I meet him upstairs, he will not be too disappointed. You're right, money is structuring a lot of things. And Friedrich Dürrenmatt's comment on planning is very right. But it is not, if you do not plan, that you have no accidents. It's maybe even worse. If you do not plan, you still have accidents. So it's always better to have a plan. And last but not least, on attracting talent partnership, I think the university is a case in point, but it's another illustration of what Luxembourg is. A European laboratory, a country where half the people are foreigners, a country that is open. And this diversity, what has it brought to Luxembourg? Well, a lot of wealth, a lot of prosperity. And we are lucky enough, we are also a very safe country. So the recipe of Luxembourg can probably not be easily replicated in all countries, but definitely in a period of fragmentation, of nationalisms, it's very nice to live in a country like this one, because we can lead by example, that we are stronger together. So your introduction gave me a lot of inspiration. I would like now to also say that what you do here as European Parliament in telling people about the challenges of Europe and what Europe does for citizens and for companies is crucial. And sometimes it is difficult to understand how Europe works. And it is not always easy to explain. And very often simplistic arguments are used to deceive people. And sometimes these simplistic or wrong arguments win the day. So we need a lot of pedagogy. And because pedagogy brings clarity, and that brings trust. And what we're lacking a lot in Europe right now is not only money, but trust. So we need to tell the story of Europe, to tell what we do and how we do it. And together we go farther, we go better, we go safer, and we will be more prosperous and also more safe. Now, there's many ways to measure how our citizens and how our companies see Europe. For what it's worth, I took the spring barometer of this spring 2024, and in terms of where our economy is heading, the result is the best since 2019. So prior to the pandemic, 47% of respondents say that they think that our economy is good. That's the highest level since 5 years. But 41 consider that the economy is faring badly. nevertheless, you can look at the growth that we have for this year and next year as rather promising. We will have growth of 1% according to the EU Commission this year and around 1.5% next year. But even if this is a good result in the aftermath of the pandemic on the one side and in the aftermath of the energy crisis, inflation provoked by the aggressive war of Russia in Ukraine, yes, we had a soft landing, but our growth is only 1/3 of the growth of the United States. And this trend has been continuing for quite some time. So we definitely have a challenge of growth which we need to address. So the overall positive sentiment I have on Europe is maybe not necessarily directly connected to the fact that we have 1% of growth or 1.5%, but more to the fact that in the face of the recent crisis, Europe has shown quite a lot of resilience and has shown a capacity to bounce back. And this capacity to bounce back or find common answers is probably what characterizes Europe. And therefore, I will spend a little bit of time looking back. So I would call this the lessons of history. Bear with me, some of you in the room know these things, but maybe not all of you. But because I think we can find food for thought in the past. But then in the lessons of history, I'm going to go a little bit to the institution of the EU, but also look at the last 15 years more precisely. Then in part 2, I'm going to focus on the challenges of today, and in the part 3, on possible solutions and the potential role of the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM, which, by the way, I take this opportunity to say it, has its headquarters here on Kirchberg, not far from here. Because I have so many friends who, when they see me sometimes in Esch or in Luxembourg, say, how is it in Brussels? So we have now larger signs on our building, which is behind Auchan if you're looking for us. But I hope you don't need us, because if you were looking for us, it means that you have a deep crisis, which I do not wish any of you. So, lessons from history. So, we are, the European construction was born and rose from the ashes of World War II. So it is definitely a peace project. I'll come back to that. And what did we do together with our American partners? The Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan foresaw $13 billion for the reconstruction of Europe, supporting 16 countries, including Luxembourg. If you actualize this number or calculate it up to today, how much $13 billion would be today, it would be $170 billion. At the time, it corresponded to 10.5% of the GDP of Europe, an enormous amount. And this generated the post-war boom that is called in French les Trente Glorieuses, with growth rates that were quite spectacular until the middle of the 70s. Then in the middle of the 70s, we had the different oil shocks and a period of stagflation. Now, some specialists, economists say that eventually today we might enter in a period of stagflation, which means, in fact, low growth, stagnation, and high inflation. I'm not sure this is the case today because the European Central Bank has reacted quite quickly in 2022 when inflation was rising fast. And when you look at the rate today compared to what we have in the 70s, there's no comparison. There were two-digit numbers for inflation in the past. So then the 80s was an interesting decade because that's the one where we sowed the seeds for the creation of the EU single market, which is one of our greatest achievements. That was then agreed in the European Single Act of 1987. The Single Act was signed in Luxembourg. And this materialized 6 years later in 1993 with the completion of the European single market, which is the great achievement of Jacques Delors and his commission. And this project has been quite successful during the 90s and 2000s, and helped Europe grow also in that period. Let's not forget that in 1992, we had a risk of collapse of the European monetary system, and that we had a tech bubble in 2000. And in those 90s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we also set up the euro in the wake of the Maastricht Treaty, which was signed in 1993. In 1999, 11 countries joined the euro, and in the meantime, many countries adhered both to the EU and to the euro area, with one single exception, is obviously the United Kingdom, which left the EU back in 2016. Today, we have 20 countries that have adopted the euro, and soon, let's knock on wood, soon, Bulgaria is going to join, so we will have 21 countries out of 27 that will use the euro, and these are the countries, the ones that have the euro, that are the members of the ESM, because the ESM is there to safeguard the euro area. For those who follow this since a long time, I would say that the creation of the euro, the setting up of the ESM and lots of other measures that were taken because we have a common currency is the deepest element of integration that we have in Europe. Some even say that it's because we have the euro, and that was in fact, I think, the theory that was already defended by Pierre Werner and others in the aftermath. It's thanks to the euro, the European construction might become irreversible. I knock on wood and I hope it's true, but even if it's not true, it's good to believe it. Let's come to more recent history, and especially to the last 15 years, where we had three major crises. What was called the sovereign debt crisis back in 2009, which also nearly became a euro crisis, the pandemic, and obviously the war in Ukraine. Three major shocks. And I must say, looking back to these three shocks, that Europe managed to navigate those three crises quite well. As Jean Monnet used to say, Europe has been forging crises and will be the sum of solutions found. I think these three examples illustrated very well and have shown that we have made significant strides in bolstering our resilience. The integrity of the euro area was preserved, the banking sector was strengthened, and the banks are the bloodline of our economies, much more so than, for example, in the United States. I would say that we have shown an unprecedented level of solidarity, particularly in the aftermath of the pandemic, as we launched the Next Generation EU program, which was created to help countries recover after the lockdowns of our economies, but also help countries rebound after these lockdowns. So this NGEU program is roughly worth 750 billion euro and is still ongoing for the next 2 years. And its magnitude is similar to the magnitude of the Marshall Plan I mentioned in the beginning, and represents 10% of the EU's GDP. So we are probably not aware that what we have decided there is really a major step into solidarity, sticking together, and not focusing on nationalism. In this NGEU program, half of it nearly is grants, the other half is subsidies. And third point, the distribution of these grants and subsidies is generously tilted toward the more vulnerable countries. If you had asked me in 2019, prior to the pandemic, if Europe were to be as generous and would have such an act of solidarity, I would not have bet on it. So it's a good surprise in the spirit of Jean Monnet's comment. And so if I would not have betted, it means a lot, because I'm a natural optimist. And those who know me know that this is the case. So in this crisis, back the pandemic in 2020, in the night of the 9th of April 2020, on top of the NGEU program I just mentioned, the European Commission, the European Investment Bank, and the ESM decided support measures to support people and businesses. In that context, the ESM proposed something that was called the Pandemic Crisis Support Mechanism, an instrument that was there to help finance health measures in the context of the pandemic. So I mention this because I'll come back to this later. Since the Russia war in Ukraine, Europe, on top of the pandemic, which we have survived, was faced with another tragedy, foremost a human one, but obviously with also economic challenges and the energy crisis which came after that. And also here Europe acted steadfast with the Repower EU program, which makes Europe less dependent on Russian gas and oil. If you look at the numbers there, we used to be dependent on Russian gas to the extent of 45%, and it's now a third of that, only 15%. We also managed to mobilize enormous amounts of money to support Ukraine, and this was done partly in European budgets. And in total, we have mobilized 145 billion euro in financial, military, humanitarian, and refugee assistance at European level to a large extent. Most recently, European leaders have also pledged 50 billion for a new Ukraine facility. What I want to underline here is that these numbers are quite huge, and this war in Ukraine was not foreseen. So this is also a European response, a collective response to this geopolitical turmoil and to this unacceptable war. So, together with the United States, we have delivered very quickly on the support of Ukraine, and this issue of the war in Ukraine is unfortunately also staying with us now for more than 2 years. So let me now, having looked a little bit back, come to part number 2, which is the challenges of today. Europe is at a new crossroads. Ahead of the European Parliament elections, which took place only last month, Eurobarometer survey showed that 37% of EU citizens put defense and security as first priorities in reinforcing the EU position globally. Another survey shows that 77% of Europeans are in favor of a common defense and security policy among EU countries. So a very high level of commitment towards this topic. According to the same survey, the war in Ukraine is considered by 35% of Europeans as the most important issue currently facing the EU. This is 7 points more than autumn last year. So I think there is now a recognition that these geopolitical issues are becoming foremost, taking center stage for most of us. We have unfortunately rediscovered the horrors of war, and I think we cannot take peace for granted as we have known it. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, Europe is also, and maybe mainly, a peace project, and please keep that in your mind when we discuss the whole issue about financing, giving financial answers to the challenges of today. Now, as ESM, we are there to help in situations of weakness and crisis of different countries, but we're also there to try to prevent those crises by analyzing which are the largest risks, the largest challenges. And we have identified 3 megatrends, which I'm going to dwell on a little bit. Let me mention them. First is obviously the geoeconomic fragmentation. Second, climate change. And the third one, aging population. Geoeconomic fragmentation. Total trade worldwide is not growing as quickly as it used to, not only in the time of the pandemic, where it was even receding, but its growth is far less than it used to be. We live in a period where globalization is being challenged and fragmentation is prominent. But this is hitting Europe more than any other parts of the world. Total trade with the rest of the world amounts for Europe at 60% of our GDP. And in this number, we exclude our trade amongst ourselves. So this is our trade as EU with the rest of the world represents 60% of our GDP. For China, this number is 38%. And for the United States, only 27%. So when trade is falling behind, the continent that is most hit by definition is Europe. This has also effects on finance. In stable times, Europe attracts a lot of investors. Some euro area assets tend to have a safe haven characteristics, but when war is looming at the doorstep of the European Union, obviously we are becoming less attractive. And in a geopolitically tense environment, there's a higher risk also of capital outflows. So I think we must not neglect that. This is probably not on the radar of most of you, but peace is very favorable to attract capital. War is not. At a time also where the European Central Bank is reducing its asset purchases, this leads to a stronger bond supply in financial markets. And this supply has been taken up a lot by foreign investors. This change in investor base can lead to an increased sensitivity to political uncertainty and market volatility. So obviously this is the kinds of analysis that we do in the ESM, and I would like to take this opportunity to greet a few of my management board members who are here today and also highlight the high quality of people I am lucky to work with. We have 230 people here on Kirchberg who do all this analysis. So I just mentioned the number one megatrend, which is geopolitical fragmentation, geopolitical risk. The second one is climate change. For some reasons that I can understand a little bit, climate change has become less fashionable for some parties or for some politicians. But for us at the ESM, and we're not alone, for many institutions and analysts, climate change remains a key megatrend, and the climate change issues are there to stay. Why are they there to stay? Not only because it can lead to extreme weather, floods and high temperatures, to physical risks and damages. It can also reduce our productivity. It also translates into the necessity to organize the transition risks. All this being said, we need to prepare for the consequences of climate change, including the issue of stranded assets, assets that can quickly lose their value because of climate change, and this again would lead to financial instability and job losses. My third point is aging population. This is obviously not a new topic, but population aging has been with us since 30 or 40 years. But the consequences of this aging population are becoming more obvious, more clear, more detrimental as the baby boomer generation now goes into pension. So, first of all, this brings along slowing productivity, and so our health and pension systems become less resilient, to say it very nicely. In fact, in most countries, they are in deficit. Currently, in Europe, we have 3 workers for every retiree. In 2050, we will have 2 workers for 1 retiree. For all of those who think that we do not need to act on this and think twice about it, these numbers, I think, are very compelling. There's many ways to tackle this. Obviously, you could say, I need to reduce my expenditures or my contributions or benefits in the pension system or the services in the health system. Obviously, this is the first thing that comes to your mind because also life expectancy is increasing. But I think one has to have also more positive approaches, some of which could be like increasing the participation rates of women, so having more jobs and definitely having more growth. Another topic which is key in this is migration. Now, migration is a very credible avenue to boost labor markets. It has lots of challenges, and we know it's also a topic that receives a lot of attention in the mind of the public. In fact, in the Commission Eurobarometer survey I mentioned earlier, immigration is the second concern of Europeans. So we need to be aware with aging population, unless we have an intelligent immigration policy, we will grow more slowly. And so let's inspire ourselves from the best models of immigration that exist in Europe and outside Europe. I hesitate, but I do it nevertheless, to mention Luxembourg in this context. Yes, we have a lot of immigration. Yes, it might be easier for a small country, but it is impossible to grow without all the newcomers. The 10 to 15,000 newcomers to Luxembourg every year. Hundreds and hundreds of new students to our university every year. So it's only this openness that can ensure more growth and better growth in the future. I know it is a worry for a lot of people, but we need to have a serious reflection on how we want to do it at the European level. Let me now come to the third and last chapter, which I call Possible Solution and the Potential Role of the ESM. All the things I have mentioned about Europe's growth and productivity are well recognized, and in a couple of days there's going to be what is called the Mario Draghi report, and the Mario Draghi report is dedicated to the issue of European productivity and competitiveness. And he has given us a little bit of a first glimpse in Ghent in February of his report. And according to his calculation, we have an investment gap in Europe of 500 billion euro per year for the whole of Europe. In order to organize the green and digital transition and just to be more productive and competitive in the future. Now, 500 billion per year, this is public investment and private investment. I'm going to come back to this topic later. Now, where will we find, and here we are in the heart of the question that's being asked in the title, where are we going to find 500 billion euro every year? Not on the street, not in the budget or in the budgets of most European countries which have no buffers, which are already at the limit. Fortunately, we have the new fiscal framework of the European Union, which will provide more space for reforms and investment. It will enter really into force next year. I look at Mariut, and we have the EIB, who is helping to crowd in private investment and has more means available. But last but not least, the national government need to deliver on what I would say reasonable budgetary discipline. And some countries have really very little room of maneuver. As we have seen a couple of days ago, the European Commission issued a document where it opened the excessive deficit procedure against 7 countries, the 7 countries being Belgium, France, Italy, and Malta, 4 countries inside the euro area, and 3 other EU countries, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia. So these countries are exceeding the 3% maximum deficit for the yearly budget, and that's why this excessive deficit procedure has been opened. So, keeping in mind that you need buffers and that these countries already are over the limit, you realize that to mobilize these 500 billions will be difficult, but a large part of the answer needs to happen at the European level. So, in the last 9 to 12 months, quite a few ideas have been flagged in different circumstances by different persons. So I'm going to mention a few, because what I'm telling you is obviously not a surprise. It is in all the media. Let me start by mentioning Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, who suggested to issue defense bonds. Obviously, this is connected to the issue of security, where he suggests this instrument. Enrico Letta, former Prime Minister of Italy, dear Jets, and who is the author of the report, which is called Europe, Much More Than a Market. Wonderful title. Yes, we are much more than a market. He suggests, amongst many other things, that the ESM could establish a credit line to help its member countries finance their defense and security expenditures. He suggests lots of other things, and I strongly recommend you to read his book because it's 147 pages. By the way, I saw him last week, and he told me on top of the report, which is the 147 pages, he wrote also a book, which is a little bit thicker, where he also comments how he got the ideas while meeting lots of people in the 27 countries of the EU. I think it could be also very interesting also for the university to look into that. And so the Letta report, amongst others, says that on top of the 4 liberties that are the core of the EU single market, the free movement of people, capital, goods and services, there should be a 5th liberty on education and invisible knowledge, which is quite compelling. One of the things he mentions there, also look at the Rector here, you probably are already aware that because you saw him also, that is that we should make the Erasmus project of exchange of students between universities in Europe much more powerful and extend it quite a lot and dedicate necessary financial resources to that. And the numbers to do that are enormous. Let me then also take this opportunity to highlight that the Luxembourg University is the #1 in Europe in terms of Erasmus students exchange. I know a number that's maybe old, but I think at the time there were 60% of students who would do the Erasmus program who are in Luxembourg, so nearly 2/3. and the statistic is also a couple of years old, the second country that does most exchanges is Austria. And have you any idea how much Austria does? Who is the second best? 2%. So what Luxembourg does is visionary. That was your predecessor, Rolf Tarr, who said that. So in fact, at the Luxembourg University, it's nearly compulsory. Students are nearly forced to do it. I mean, there's a long way to get there. But
bachelor, it is mandatory.
It is mandatory in bachelor, you see. And so what I want to say in this report of Letta, there's much more than just what I highlight here. I encourage you to read it. Coming back to suggestions that were made, Olli Rehn, the governor of the Central Bank of Finland, suggested collecting funds from the ESM to fund aid to Ukraine. Jean-Claude Juncker, also our former prime minister and president of the Commission, suggested the ESM could help Ukraine in one way or another. More recently, the G7 found a very original way to support Ukraine with a 50 billion program. So just to show that the needs are huge and are needed badly. So some other proposals I would like to highlight is, for example, the last speech at the Sorbonne of Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who also suggested to use European financial stability mechanisms with an S to finance investments. The same President Macron suggested that we should double the EU budget, double it. And it's a MFF, it's a multi-annual financial framework budget of the EU is a 6-year program, comes to an end in 26. So he's talking about what comes after 26. So again, that was my remark in the beginning. I'm not going to go into all these suggestions, but it's just to show you that everyone is aware that we need a European financial response in the situation we're in. Paolo Gentiloni, the Italian commissioner whom I met yesterday, again proposed that we need an EU-wide central fiscal capacity. Now, I agree with you, this is a very complicated name, but basically it's to say you need European funds on a general basis in these times. Fabio Panetta, the executive board member of the ECB, calls for something similar. What does that all indicate? And here I'm in the heart of the topic and of the title, and it is that focusing more on EU-level financing to tackle all the major challenges I mentioned, and especially the 3 megatrends, is unavoidable. So let me now, in this last part of my presentation, just highlight the ideas that have a link with the ESM and to see what the ESM in itself can do. So first of all, we have a firepower or a lending capacity of 500 billion euro, out of which 422 billion euro are available. So in these challenging times, obviously this is a lot of money. How can that be used? You have heard in the proposals that were made by some that the idea floats that we should help Ukraine directly. Now, this sounds very intuitive, but this is not possible. The ESM is there to support its 20 member countries. So we cannot help directly Ukraine. To say it in very simple words, that would require a treaty change. Let's therefore leave this idea aside for a moment, and let's see what the ESM could do in its existing mandate. That means towards its own member countries. So first, the idea of Enrico Letta of a defense, which would be a credit line for defense and security expenditures. So Enrico Letta there draws a comparison with the pandemic crisis support that the ESM had suggested itself back in 2020 to, in fact, help the countries of the euro area finance health-related costs due to the pandemic. And so What happened at the time, and I was at the time in the board of governors of the ESM, it was a reasoning that was very simple to say, because of the lockdown of the economy of all the countries in Europe, we will have risks of financial instability. And that's why we have the European Stability Mechanism. That's why we should have such a product, such a credit line. Now, the parallel that Enrico Letta is doing is saying, well, we should create something similar for the expenditures that are going to be triggered by the security and defense needs. Is that possible? Yes, it is possible, but it's important to understand how this would work in the ESM. We would need to have a consensus by the 20 member countries to do so in the same way as we had a consensus back in 2020 for the expenditures related to health. And obviously, it would mean that you would draw the conclusion that the geopolitical tension and the war in Ukraine are triggering financial instability in all or in some member countries of the EU. Now, I could give you an example that we have already seen, and that is that countries that are very close to the border of Russia are forced to pay a risk premium because of their geographic location. So you could say, well, if the situation persists, these countries are penalized, and despite having a good economic policy, good fiscal policies, which is the case of some of them, they could ask the ESM for support. This would be what we call in our jargon precautionary loans or instruments, and that would help prevent financial crisis. So we have not only macroeconomic programs with heavy conditionality, as we have done with the 5 countries we supported back in the last decade, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Cyprus, and Ireland, but here it would be a kind of precautionary instrument to prevent a crisis. It would work a little bit like an insurance. To tell you in a few words, the ESM is ready to work with its member countries on such an idea. The second proposal, which is also in the Letta report, would be that we aggregate all European issuances under the same name. So we have 3 institutions in Europe that issue bonds, which are European labeled. It's the European Investment Bank, it's the European Commission, and it's the ESM. Together, we have already issued more than 1 trillion of bonds, which are considered safe assets. And so, to reinforce this idea of European safe assets, the Letta report encourages us to have a similar name. It would be too long to dwell on it, but just I wanted to mention it because it is an interesting idea. Third thing, the financing of investment. Could the ESM finance investment? This could be triggering a treaty change, because what we do as ESM is support the finances of our member countries. So it's budget support. So unless the scope of loans would be narrowed for the purpose of addressing financial stability risks, as this was the case in the pandemic crisis support, or could be eventually the case with what I said with security and defense expenditures, we are not there to support individual investments like the EIB, for example, does. Fourth proposal, a central fiscal capacity. Could the ESM provide that? In November 2022, the ESM itself proposed the creation of a stability fund. It would have, in fact, the function that is suggested, for example, by Commissioner Gentiloni, and it would then issue loans on favorable terms and be activated in the event of external shocks, like we have one now with the war in Ukraine. We could do such a task, and we can obviously only do that for the euro area member countries. No treaty change would be required for that, and it would be relatively easy to be set up in terms of administration, not least because existing ESM infrastructure could be used. Finally, let me add a comment to all of this to show that we are very active on reflecting on this. We had the Board of Governors last week here in Luxembourg at our headquarters, where we presented what we call a toolkit review, which in fact is a review of our financial instruments. We have 7 such instruments, and we presented that to the finance ministers, who are our governors. And what we want to achieve with this exercise is to double check if the instruments that were invented a dozen of years ago, 15 years ago nearly, are still fit for purpose. One thing is certain is that the crises change over time in nature and in scope. So that's why you need to do this exercise of reviewing your instruments on a regular basis. The IMF has done it recently. We have done it. We have focused a lot here on the precautionary instruments I mentioned before, because preventing a crisis is far less expensive than helping a country that is already at a cliff edge. And mentioning the different types of crises, and we all have in mind now security and defense, but you could also think of climate change as being an external risk that is definitely there, but could become more powerful in terms of negative consequences. And obviously, we need to also double check if our instruments could be used in those cases. Let me maybe say at the end a word to the importance of private investment. Obviously, what I have just alluded to is what the ESM can do, that is public investment. But obviously, private investment is key. Of the 500 billion of Mario Draghi that I mentioned before, you could say that probably around 20% needs to be public investment. All the rest is from the private sector. And so what can we do to attract more finance in the investments that Europe needs? One important factor would be to have a capital markets union. I'm not going to go into the details of this. We have discussed this in the Eurogroup that I attend every month on a regular basis, and the Eurogroup has recently agreed on a roadmap to achieve this, and I encourage you to have a look at that. So, Capital Markets Union would be a European contribution, an indirect one, if you want, and coming from the private sector. Another thing, and that I get now very close to my conclusion, is obviously to boost growth. We need to boost growth. And one answer is the Letta report, strengthening the single market. Now, let me say a few words on the way this can be misunderstood and the way it should be understood. When we say we need to boost the EU single market, it can sound in the eyes and in the ears of people that the EU single market hasn't worked, that we need to redo it. It's not that it hasn't worked. It has wonderfully worked. It was the major engine growth of Europe. But the economy has changed. Things that we resolved in 1993, in the 90s, with the 80s and 90s with the EU single market, were fine. But there was no artificial intelligence, there was no digital investments, there were no cryptocurrencies, and so on, and so on. So we need to update, to do an aggiornamento of the EU single market. That's what it is about. So the idea in itself was an excellent one. We need to modernize it. And I think there's great consensus about this, and there's a lot of potential to this, and this will boost productivity and competitiveness. But that alone will not do the trick. Everyone will have to do his homework. That means do the necessary structural reforms in his own country. Now, very few politicians dwell on that. There's always the tendency to say Europe should do, Europe can here, others can, but let's face it, everyone has also to do its homework. So in the Eurogroup debates, this message sometimes is a little bit forgotten, so that's why I mention it here. Europe alone cannot do the trick. This presentation was dedicated to the fact that we can be innovative in terms of financing through Europe, for sure. There's lots of things that can be done, but there's a lot of responsibility also in the member countries. So I'm not going to summarize in the conclusion all the things I've said. I'm just going to conclude to tell you that I would be inspired if we would remember my presentation with the formula and the words of Winston Churchill, who said, "The pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty." Let me reassure you, the ESM definitely is an optimistic institution. Thank you.
Mr. Gramegna, does it work? No? Now, does it work? Yes. Okay, thanks. Mr. Gramegna, thanks a lot for your inspiring speech, which was very dense of hints, suggestions. You raised quite a lot of points which are of quite a lot of interest for many of us. So I would invite you to make questions. Please take the floor, stand up, say your name and institution, please.
Hello, Sébastien Huynh, European Investment Bank.
Turn it on, please.
My question is, please explain us how would be managed the bankruptcy of a huge bank like BNP Paribas or Deutsche Bank?
You want to respond directly, or maybe we collect? Okay.
Well, I can take this one. That's never going to happen.
Too big to fail.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, more seriously, we have learned from the sovereign debt crisis quite a lot of things, and I haven't mentioned in the nevertheless quite extensive summary all the things that Europe has done as a response to this crisis. The banking union, and in the banking union there's lots of things that have been agreed, and one of them is that there was a common willingness of countries that in case of failure of a bank, it should not be taxpayers' money that should save the banks. In order to have another solution for that, a single resolution fund was established in all the countries, depending on the size of banks and deposits. And between 2016 and 2024, all countries collected that money from the banks, and they have collected close to 80 billion euro, which are in the single resolution fund. Now, in a treaty which amends or adds to our founding treaty, the ESM has also the task to give an additional layer of protection, and it's called the backstop to the Single Resolution Fund, and we have earmarked 68 billion euro for the same purpose. And so that nearly doubles the available money. And let me also say that if we were to use that additional amount, this would again need be reimbursed by banks. So we have set up something that is rather unique in the world because it's transnational. It is a European-wide system, by the way, to which not only the Euro area countries adhere, but the EU 27 through bridges. This being said, what is key is that we have now banks which are supervised, the largest banks are supervised by the national authorities together with the European Central Bank to have, I think, a more thorough monitoring of the banks. And last but not least, if you look at the buffers that our banks have accumulated, being for liquidity or for capital, these buffers are among the highest in the world. So that's why my answer was that it will never happen, but never is never happening. Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. Our host.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this fascinating speech. My question is just a semantic issue. When you spoke about the objectives of the EFSF, you mentioned not only stability, but also solidarity, I know. And I remember, not so long ago, a conference at the ESM with the participation of the president of the court, who himself qualified ESM as solidarity mechanism. You have a very good staff, a very good lawyer, but could we give now an interpretation according which stability is just an intermediate objective, but the final pre-existing reality is that it is a solidarity mechanism? Sorry.
That's an excellent question. I love it. I was in the room when that happened, yes, the judge, the EU judge of the Court of Justice said, yes, there is the Pringle court case about the ESM, and then he spells out ESM standing for European Solidarity Mechanism. And nobody noticed, unlucky for him, I was there, so I highlighted that, but in a joking mode. And you know, this quid pro quo, or this lapsus, was one of these nice things that happen in conferences. Because I said to him, you know, you're not wrong. It's not what it stands for, but that's what it's all about. But, Etienne, I would say, the goal is not solidarity. The goal is stability. And to achieve stability, you need solidarity. So I am completely with you. So I think the name is correct. We are there to ensure the financial stability. The word stability is meant for financial stability, because that safeguards the euro area. And in order to get there, well, we support countries. Supporting countries is having solidarity with countries. So I think this lapsus was very telling, and I'm glad you highlight that.
There was one question from there first. There.
Hello, I'm a student at the Leinster International School and part of the European Youth Parliament. And in that context, I worked on a committee on press freedom. And we had the opportunity to talk to a war journalist. She's called Joanne de Rijke from the Netherlands. And she was captured by the Taliban, actually, and only had the chance to come free because the French government paid some money. So this is definitely a challenge that more and more journalists are facing violence. So I was wondering if that could also be a possibility to use the funds. And there's this idea of creating a fund which can be used for situations like that. However, it is a very complex question because other people also say it might increase the possibility of kidnappings because it makes it more attractive if there is a fund behind it. for terrorists. So I would like to know your opinion on that, how we can tackle this problem. Thank you.
There is a problem of moral hazard.
Yes, first.
No, yeah. No, I think they struck me too. Hello? No?
I spoke too much.
Maybe, yeah.
Hello?
Yeah,
Voilà.
okay.
Faut pas toucher.
The micro got tired of me.
Not yet, not yet.
Not yet, okay. No, you know, it happens often in such conferences that you get questions you are not prepared for. And sometimes, you know, the imagination goes really beyond what you can prepare for. So what I want to say very seriously, this is a serious topic, but definitely one that needs to be tackled behind closed doors, because every time you pay a ransom, every country that does that will always deny that they pay a ransom. Then you have to make up your mind if they really did pay one or did not pay one. So having said that, this is a serious topic, but definitely not one that has ever been thought of by us as the team in the ESM, and certainly not in the mind of our forefathers and founders of the ESM. And last but not least, on a very serious note, what I have maybe not dwelled sufficiently upon is the following. The ESM needs to be used when there's a risk of financial instability in one or more countries of the euro area. So I think what you're alluding to is not triggering any financial instability risk in a member country or in the whole area. And so it would really not qualify at all for our task.
Yep.
Alfred Steinher, Honorary Chief Economist of the European Investment Bank and founding Rector of the University of Bolzano.
Put the micro closer.
I would like to comment on the need for 500 billion annual additional investment. You know, financial institutions, they collect money from savers directly or through the capital market, and that can then be lent on. So whatever you do to financial institutions, this will not generate the additional 500 billion. Banks can allocate it differently, but there is an amount of savings that is being used for investment, private and public, deficits of governments, and foreign investments. And it so happens that the European Union is a major net investor abroad. So if you want to find 500 additional billion, either incentives are created for Europeans to save more, for governments to lend to make smaller deficits, or to make lesser net surpluses through our trade with the rest of the world. But whatever you do to the financial market, that may increase the efficiency, but that doesn't generate 500 billion. You may give more money to the ESM, then that money will missing to others. You're just reallocating, but you are not creating additional resources. Thanks.
Well, if I may, I just remind our colleague and guest that we also had some economists called John Maynard Keynes who talked about the multipliers, fiscal multipliers. So depending on what you invest on your money, it can generate more money, and so it becomes, it becomes growth. But please, to respond.
Well, yeah, no, thank you very much for mentioning John Maynard Keynes. I think probably the most innovative economist of the 20th century and maybe of the whole history of economists. It's less fashionable since the 80s, but I think we have, to a large extent, rediscovered him in this century. This being said, Alfred, thank you nice to see you again, and thank you for the excellent question. I will give a few comments to your question, not challenging completely what you said, because it's certainly true to a certain extent. Especially because you mentioned at one time, maybe we need more savings. Europe is the world champion of savings, probably with China and Japan, although I do not know the latest numbers, but we save enormously, especially in the pandemic times, and still now, 4 years after the pandemic, the ratio of savings is higher than it was prior to the pandemic. And the strange thing is that we are not good at, and when I say we, as observers or politicians or international financial institutions, it is very difficult to understand or to have a convincing explanation why we cannot transform those savings into investment. So you can also blame the banks. Some people hate banks, so they blame the banks. But it's a bit short. Maybe banks are risk averse. Now, to tell you the truth, they have to have buffers here in Europe that are higher than in the rest of the world. Yes, it's good for the security and the safety of banks and the resilience of banks on the one hand, but then they need to be more cautious. So I don't want to leave the banks completely off the hook, but certainly they need to be more careful than in other parts of the world because of these regulations and surveillance, and think of Basel III, for example. Point number 2, I think, Alfred, I went a bit fast on this. We need public investment and private. And the ratio is, I mentioned 80 to 20. Some say it's 2/3, 1/3. And there's no clear-cut evidence of what the number really is. But it's clear that the major part is private investment. And what I think we have seen with the European Investment Bank is an excellent example. What happens with public money, so the money that the countries put into the European Investment Bank, we were able over decades to boost and make possible investments that otherwise would not have been done by the private sector. So in other words, thanks to the public intervention, you have a leverage effect and a de-risking effect. So I think that's something in Europe that we are very keen on, and that I think we could and should pursue even more. I give you also the example of the functioning of the ESM, which I didn't have the opportunity to say, and you probably know it, Alfred, but for the benefit of the others, we issue loans for the countries we want to support. But the way we do that is by having a paid-in capital of 81 billion euro, which all the member countries of the euro area have paid in. And these 81 billion, we manage these 81 billion, we don't spend them. That is our guarantee for the markets. And thanks to these 81 billions, we can lend up to 500 billions on the market at a AAA rating. And this low level of interest rates, we pass over to the countries we support. So our capital remains intact. So it's this leveraging effect which is important. So in other words, it is important to find a way to crowd in the private investment through such mechanism as the EIB has for individual projects. This being said, what I said, my first part of the answer is, how can we make sure that our banks in Europe particularly have more tendency to finance productive and competitive projects. Last but not least, let's not forget, because we speak about public versus private, about liberalism eventually versus more European socialist approach. Look at what the United States is doing. This is the 360 billion euro IRA program is a spectacular Keynesian instrument. Spectacular. To such an extent that European companies are investing a lot in the United States thanks to that public investment. So there is no, for me, this must and should not be a political discussion if you're left or right, liberal or not. I think we should inspire ourselves of new models where you can have a smart interaction between public and private financing.
Okay, Giovanni, first, sorry. Oh,
Question to what you just saying.
yeah, first, maybe.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Stefan Kohler. I'm the president of Europa Union Luxembourg, not-for-profit organization for Europe, independent and in Luxembourg. Regarding the paid-in capital, you just mentioned it. The ESM has more than 80 billion of paid-in capital from its members, and you have currently outstanding loans, if I'm not mistaken, of less than 80 billion. In addition, of course, you have the firepower indeed to support for more than 400 billion, which itself helps to calm the market, and which was actually the very idea behind the EFSF and then the ESM to calm the market, and it was successful in that. On the other hand, it's of course obvious with these numbers that you have paid-in capital which is higher than your loans outstanding, how to deploy that capital actually and how to make even better use of it. The question I have, how likely is it that it will be used in the near future with some of these proposals on the table? And secondly, what would be done if it doesn't happen? Because at some point, I don't think it's efficient that you have public money just sitting there and then not really using it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. This is an excellent question. Can you repeat the institution you're in or the association? I didn't understand.
Europa Union.
Europa Union Luxembourg.
Oh, okay. So a couple of things here. We are first and foremost an insurance. So if you have a fire insurance to protect your house, and your house doesn't burn for many years, are you canceling your insurance? Or you have an insurance and your house burns the second year, and then you're really happy that you are having insurance. And then after 2 more years, you cancel the insurance because you said, well, I was lucky, I had an insurance, I don't need it anymore. So you have to understand that this paid-in capital, yes, it is public money. Yes, it allows to issue bonds, but that money is there. It's not even spent. It's the most intelligent way of supporting or safeguarding a country, or in this case 20 countries, compared to what other international financial institutions do. By the way, we have a network of regional financial arrangements, like there's an Arab Monetary Fund, there's a FLAR in South America. We are in contact with those. They all recognize that we are lucky to have this paid-in capital and a system that is extremely credible and helps us, and we've seen it with the 5 countries we have supported, not only to do it without additional cost for countries because they have paid in the capital, but for the rest it doesn't cost them anything. And the countries that get the support, they reimburse all the loans that they get. So it's a very efficient system. There is another part of your question, and it's equally important, and that is, of all the ideas that have been mentioned here, what is the likelihood that some of them materialize? Well, the simple answer is they will materialize when 20 countries, the 20 member countries of the ESM agree to utilize one of the 7 instruments for a specific purpose. So, obviously, we are an intergovernmental institution. You need consensus. We have shown in the last decade that this works, and I'm confident that this can work in the future. Last but not least, the ESM shouldn't be seen as being really eager whenever a crisis is at the horizon to say, hey, wait a minute, here we are. We are the firefighters, and this is also not the role. You can say it, we are the lender of last resort, or you can say it differently, we are also therefore precautionary loans to prevent crisis. So there's different way to look at it. So why do I think that defense and security and defense is an important topic at the present juncture is because I think that this security and defense risk is there to stay in the medium and long term. And if it stays in the medium and long term, the amount of money that is needed for that is quite huge. And that's why I highlighted that despite the fact that the new Stability and Growth Pact rules are new and slightly more flexible and allow for more investment, the room of maneuver of many countries is very limited. So for me, this is the kind of essence of topic where it is worthwhile finding a European answer. So I think with this, I've covered all the angles of your excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. I think it's the last one, they told me. Maybe I take also that very quickly.
Thank you so much. Giovanni Farese, European University of Rome. I see ideas are there, and the financial means are there. My question is, and I'll probably go back to some of the questions that have already been asked, is how much political will you see to go in the direction. Let me just repeat what you mentioned in the Letta report. Mr. Letta says that in Europe there are 33 trillion euros in private savings, predominantly held in current account, which is double the size of the GDP of the whole EU, which means that there's a paradox. Europe is a rich area in which we have underinvestment. And my guess is that the capital markets unit is important, but unless we have a European safe asset, which is Eurobonds, the problem is not going to be fixed in terms of common projects for common investment. So how many leaders do you see around the table from your experience, or how many leaders have you seen around the table that think that these are the visionary hopes of poets, to use your father's word? Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni.
This is also a very good question, and it's more a political question. And as I said at the end, I'm definitely an optimist. I would like just to refer to the recent history, and the recent history is recent history is we did not have an ESM. That means we created a common currency back in 1999 without having a lender of last resort, without thinking that we need an institution to safeguard the euro area. Interesting. So when the first heavy crisis comes, we realize, oh, we have a missing link in the chain. I say we, to simplify, countries knocked at the door of the IMF, and the IMF said, sorry guys, I mean, we're not there for such situations, and what is required in terms of means to support rich countries as yours goes beyond what we have available in the IMF. Number two, hey guys, I simplify on purpose because intellectually it's simple. You have a common currency, you should help yourself. That's how the ESM was created. So the ESM was created after a crisis. So it cannot be more a crisis instrument than being created because of a crisis. Now that we have the instrument, I think we could and we should leverage it. And the pandemic crisis support instrument I mentioned was such an answer, and there was consensus in the lockdown period to use it. It was finally not really triggered and used by countries. Why? Because there were so many other measures in place. The NGEU, the guarantees of the European Investment Bank, and the 0% interest rate policy, accommodative monetary policy of the ECB. And NGEU, remember, half of it is grants. When you go to the ESM, it's loans. You have to reimburse them. So for those reasons, it was not really used. So I want to say we have one example where this readiness to propose something has been shown, was accepted by 20 countries. So why would it not happen in the future? Now, the pandemic is for me an excellent example because it's an external shock, something that you cannot control. The same goes for the war in Ukraine and geopolitical instability. If that external shock is there to stay, Europe needs to find also a European answer. If Europe finds an answer which would be, we do a defense agency for Europe, in which we send billions of euros, fine. If we double the EU budget, as was suggested by Macron, sorry, for President Macron, and if we were to say, and half of that budget should be to have a European defense policy, I'm fine with it. I'm fine. It's not about me. I think the ESM would not be there saying, wait a minute, no, we want to do that. No. I mean, if we recognize we want to do this together, this is about really European financing initiatives, then we should do that. Are we at that juncture? I don't think we're at that juncture yet to do such an agency. Could it be smart to say, oh, we have the ESM, which has some firepower, which is the right word in this context. They have some funds available to start something along those lines. I think it is worthwhile exploring. And fortunately or unfortunately, we are 20 member countries and we are intergovernmental. That means we need to have a consensus of 20 countries. But that sounds tougher than it is. Because, I mean, if France and Germany, for example, would say, I think the ESM here should be called in, I suppose that many other countries would think, and if those countries realize this is necessary, I suppose the others are also going to see it. So we are not there to rush. We need to build consensus. I spend most of my time speaking with our member countries about a smart use of the instrument we have. The smart use meaning, depending on the shocks we're facing, one should not forget the ESM, and we as an institution, as managing director with my team, we're always ready to sit down and see how we can help.
Thank you. The last question, yes? It's coming.
Thank you, Mr. Gramegna. I have a question. 2 weeks ago, at your seat was sitting a very powerful woman. She was the European prosecutor, and she made a very nice presentation. She mentioned that she's working hard, and I really believe on her and her commitment. But despite her commitment, she said that she's able, annually to collect 2% of the money on the hands of the criminals in Europe. And she also mentioned corruption. So how would you link the coefficient of 98% of this missing money with your job? Thank you.
Yes, this is also a question that's really far away from the remit of the ESM, but as a citizen I have an opinion on this. This 2% that we collect is certainly not enough, but those 2%, because it is a European public prosecutor, should go in European initiatives. And the more we collect, the better, and that should definitely go into European institutions for whatever good destination and goal we want to have. And in fact, that we have a European prosecutor who was then sitting here two weeks ago. If you had asked me as an optimist and many others 10 or 15 years ago that we would ever have a European public prosecutor, you would have been considered a dreamer. This is never going to happen. That's what most people would answer. So NGEU, the solidarity, so I think we have quite a few examples where Europe raises up to the challenges and finds solution, as Jean Monnet said. And I think we are in that state of mind, and I will never despair of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are, of course, many other questions, I'm sure. Unfortunately, the time is finished, and expectations about the possible different uses of the ESM are many, because of course you cited the 71 billion of capital paid in, but you have a subscribed capital of more than 700 billion euros. So if you think of the leverage that you're using now, you might think about 4 trillions that might be put into the service of this architecture for providing European public goods, because basically you were talking about European public goods, struggle against climate change, European security and defense, and this kind of things. But anyway, the time is over. Thank you very much for your splendid speech, and we now leave the floor to Bernard Snoy for his concluding remarks.
Mr. Managing Director, Mr. Director, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, let me first of all thank all the organizers of this evening for doing this in cooperation with the Robert Triffin International Association. We are really very grateful that this great speech and this debate that we have had is associated with the name of Robert Triffin and with the important causes for which all over his life he militated. Now, I don't know perhaps how much each of the persons here in the room know about the Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin, who made a number of very important contributions in all the international monetary and economic initiatives after World War II. He was one of the inventors of the European Payments Union, which made possible the return to multilateralism in trade at the time of the Marshall Plan. He was a friend here in Luxembourg of Pierre Werner. He was a friend of Jean Monnet at a different moment in the construction of Europe. For instance, when we had to construct the exchange rate mechanism of the European monetary system, he contributed to finding clever solutions coming a little bit out of the box. He is also one of the fathers of the special drawing rights. Of course, his main interest in his academic career and in the advice that he gave to important politicians in America, in Europe, was the good functioning of the international monetary system. And probably you may have heard that he is the inventor of the so-called Triffin dilemma, which says that when the currency of one particular country is used as the global currency, it can never serve properly the needs at the same time of the economy of the country issuing that currency and the need of the international economy. And he was right. In fact, the original Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971. We moved into some sort of a non-system, and he was always linking many of the problems that we have encountered since then to the absence of a response to that dilemma. In 2002, an international association was created in Belgium, based in the University of Louvain-la-Neuve, to perpetuate his intellectual heritage. And the president and founder was Alexandre Lamfalussy, a great international person who was the president of the European Monetary Institute after having been managing director of the Bank for International Settlement. And a few years later, we launched what we call the Triffin 21 initiative. That is to demonstrate that Triffin is not only a subject for historians or people who are looking into his archives, but that his fundamental ideas have great relevance for the problems of the 21st century. And that was the moment when we initiated Triffin lectures. And we are very pleased, Mr. Gramegna, that you accepted to give us today this magnificent Triffin lecture. The first speaker who gave the first Triffin lecture in 2010 was Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, who had been in the executive board of the European Central Bank, who was later on Minister of Finance of Italy. And the topic, which is still with us, was the link between at that time, that was the great economic and financial crisis, but we are in a world perpetually threatened by new crises. The link between those crises and precisely what he called the global monetary disorder. And we are still with that. In the meantime, we have had Michel Camdessus, Jacques de la Rosière, Jean Lemierre, and many other very prominent speakers to talk to us. We supported in 2010 the so-called Palais Royal initiative. It was in fact launched by Michel Camdessus, a former managing director of the IMF, Alexandre Lamfalussy, and Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa. They brought together more than 20 former central bank governors, including Paul Volcker, who signed a report giving a number of very concrete steps that had to be done to reform the international monetary system. Unfortunately, this report coincided, it was published in 2011, with the onset of the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone, and to be honest, the report was shelved. We continued to promote these ideas, to complement this report, for instance, by a report on how the special drawing rights could become a lever to reform the international monetary system. We were always concerned, like Robert Triffin was, with the notion that international liquidity is an international public good that needs to be managed. And we published a report on that subject that you can find on the website of our organization. Last year, again, Michel Camdessus, together with Indian economist Anup Singh and myself, we published a new, document on the essential reform of the international monetary system, coming with a number of ideas like more fairness in the governance of the International Monetary Fund, enlargement of the mandate of the IMF, for instance, in its role of lender of last resort, in its role of multilateral supervision, including on capital flows, on its role in the case of sovereign debt rescheduling. So we continue to be active. We organize regularly conferences. We had in May a big conference in Lisbon with Banco de Portugal and Academy of Science of Lisbon on the topics of regionalism and multilateralism, because that is also a characteristic of Robert Triffin's thought. When reforms are blocked at the global level, and to be honest, now the international system is more unraveling, or as Mr. Gramegna said, we are in a danger of very serious geopolitical or geoeconomic fragmentation, which involves a significant cost for all, but perhaps we can act more at a regional level. And we talked about regional monetary unions, regional monetary arrangements. And of course, it's good that we are here today in Luxembourg, since the European Stability Mechanism is by far the most elaborate mechanism of cooperation. Let me come perhaps to some of what we could call the takeaways of the remarkable conference that we have heard and the debate that followed. I think we will all remember a number of key words. The first one, Mr. Gramegna, and I like it very much, is trust. Trust or confidence. Nothing great can happen unless the people have confidence in the elite, unless we can have confidence in the institutions that have been created to defend our common good. And there is, for that, a great need, as you said, of pedagogy, understanding, explanation. And the next word, of course, is the historical perspective that you have given. We cannot separate the need to explain where we stand from the move that we have seen. And the main lesson of history, as you said, is the resilience of the European project. And you quoted Jean Monnet saying that Europe is the sum of the response to all the crises, and Europe, despite all the doomsayers, has managed always to transform crises into opportunities. The next word we will remember, of course, it is in the title, it is the challenges, the new challenges, the evolving challenges. We always have had big challenges. It's not obvious to bring together 20 countries with one currency. It requires convergence, which is very difficult to reach. It requires the respect of a certain number of rules, including the famous fiscal rules. But to these challenges, to the challenges that come also from the inherent instability of financial markets, or banking crisis can come back, and also let us be mindful of crises that may come from non-banking financial intermediaries. On top of that, we have seen a series of crises. The COVID and the Ukraine have been mentioned, but we stand in front of perhaps the most huge crisis, which comes from the climate transition, and not only the questions of climate, but it is associated with the great dangers to biodiversity, which conditions the survival also of mankind, and the basic issue identified by the Club of Rome, which are the limitations in the resources of the planet. This requires a huge adaptation. Adaptation means also investments, and if we fail to adapt, we will have a crisis for which we will need institutions such as yours. Then aging, demography, pensions, healthcare are for European countries, contrary to Africa or other parts of the world, a huge. And then, of course, geopolitical fragmentation is not only geoeconomic or political, it is geomilitary. And so we have now to invest more in security and defense. And we have to contemplate some fallback from globalization to secure our access to resources, and therefore we enter in a completely new type of world. The challenge in moving from one stage to the other are enormous and add to the already existing challenges. And what, of course, was refreshing was to see that there is here in Luxembourg this institution, the European Stability Mechanism, which not only has been successful for what it has done in the past, but is creative, is broadening the range of its instruments, and is thinking about what it could do more. And we are really impressed by what you said, and also by the sources where you get inspiration. I think we should all read the Enrico Letta report, extremely important. See with also the suggestions that he is making, that perhaps the European Stability Mechanism could have a role in the financing of military expenditures. We look forward to reading soon the Draghi report on competitiveness and industrial policy. By the way, industrial policy is going to cost a lot of money. And we see that already in the United States. And if the European Union wants to keep up, that will be an additional pressure on finances and stability. By the way, when we were in Lisbon, we heard a very interesting keynote speech of your former colleague, a Portuguese minister of finance, not Centeno, but Vitor Gaspar, who is now the head of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. And he mentioned a trilemma, which I'm afraid all politicians must have in their mind, because we face at the same time very strong, where I have soon to finish, spending pressures, very big political red lines against new taxation, and the need for financial sustainability and stability. And he said one of the three has to give. The same is true, by the way, about energy, where you have another trilemma, where you need to have at the same time security of supply, affordability of energy, and ecological transition. Okay, so the challenges are absolutely huge. We heard you also saying that, of course, the European Stability Mechanism has to do that in a global framework. Now, there are many other European institutions, European Central Bank, here in Luxembourg, the European Investment Bank, but also the private sector. And that is perhaps the greatest of all the challenges, and how to enlist the private investors in these huge tasks. And the last, perhaps important word to remember is political will. This will be possible not only when generous and enlightened people like Mr. Gramegna propose things, but also when the responsible people at all the national levels do their homework of convergence, and their homework of structural reforms. Last but not least, I mean, if I have to make a conclusion more in the Triffin style, I would recommend always to think systemically. I mean, the problems that Triffin has identified are essentially always systemic. And if, for instance, as you said, the savings of the Europeans do not go to the investments, this may be because there are flaws in the system. And that was also indeed the purpose of denouncing the Triffin dilemma. And last but not least, of course, what you do so well in Europe, think about also its applicability in the other continents. I think that the links between Europe and Africa is absolutely essential. Fabio Masini, and you can see that on our website, has proposed the plan of EU-African solidarity based on the transfer of the unused special drawing rights attributed to members of the European Union, which those members do not need. And that could be used as a collateral for major borrowing supporting development in Africa. We could also think about what we should do, then help to do in Latin America, where they have only the embryo of regional monetary support system. And we can also talk about the ASEAN, what have the Chiang Mai initiative. So I think I have to stop here. But again, thank you very, very much for allowing the Robert Triffin International Association to be associated with the important evening of tonight. Thank you very much.
There is a reception here on the left, and please, we should all have left the area for 5 to 9. Otherwise, it complicates the security. So thank you for your understanding. Thank you.